Hey guys, and welcome back to the FFP. It's time to get into part 2 of our Week 10 start sit research for you guys. So, you know what? No intro, no information. Let's just get to our first game. Let's talk about the Vikings at the Chargers. We'll talk about the Vikings first. For starters, I think you need to sit Kirk Cousins. Now, he actually got off to a pretty hot start to the year, and at times he was a little bit underrated. But he's really been kind of off the last 5 games, hasn't had the same amount of fantasy value, kind of trending downwards in that sense. And now he plays the Chargers. They're giving up the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. In their last 3 games, they've been phenomenal. In those last 3 games, they're averaging less than 200 yards passing against them, and they've given up just 2 touchdowns. Definitely sit Kirk Cousins in this one. He's got weapons. He'll probably throw a lot to try to keep up with the Chargers, but for me, I think you got better options out there. Dalvin Cook must start. You play the Chargers, great pass defense. Well, what do they have? They have a bad run defense, so it's going to be a very, especially early in that game. Later on, they'll probably switch over to the pass more, but especially in the first half, Dalvin Cook should see a lot of touches and be very productive. Chargers give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing backs. In fact, they've given up 9 touchdowns to running backs in their last 4 games, and Dalvin Cook is an RB1, must play him. As far as the wide receivers go, you got to play Justin Jefferson. He's 15th in wide receiver scoring. You got to play Adam Thielen. He's 13th in wide receiver scoring, 7 touchdowns in 8 games. Not lower your expectations, right? They've really played super well. I wouldn't expect them to play like wide receiver ones in this game, but they are going to be all right. Again, lower your expectations because they are going against the Chargers, giving up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to wideouts. That being said, Devonta Smith last week went off for 116 yards and a touchdown against them, so it's not like they are, completely immune to good, solid performances from good wide receivers. In fact, I'd say both of these guys, as of right now, are better fantasy receivers than Devonta Smith, so that's something to pay attention to there. They could have just a fine game, though, again, understand that their ceilings are not going to be monstrous. Taking a look at the tight end there, Tyler Conklin. You can consider starting him if you want. He's not great, but he's a fairly safe play. He's averaging 9 fantasy points per game. He's got back-to-back games with 7 targets. Now, the thing with that being, he hasn't scored since week 3, and that's the issue for him. But he's actually a fairly high-volume tight end, and if you were finding the end zone a bit more, he'd be a solid fantasy option. But you can play him in deep leagues. I'm talking about 14-team leagues or larger. You need to sit Greg Joseph. He is the 3rd kicker in fantasy points per game. He has been very effective. And then as far as the Vikings defense, they can be a low-end 10 to 14 range start. They're 10th in defensive scoring. They've got a high floor but a very low ceiling. Taking a look now at the Chargers side of the football, you got to start Justin Herbert. He has been top 3 in fantasy scoring in 50% of his last 6 games. He has been very productive, and he's got good wide receivers, great weapons around him. Play him, and also play Eckler. Eckler is top 3 in running back scoring, and he's an obvious start. I don't even need to break it down for you. He's a dual threat running back, the sole starter in that offense who doesn't compete for time. He catches well, he runs well, he finds the end zone well. No arguments there. As far as the wide receivers go, you need to play Keenan Allen. The Vikings give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And over his last 2 games, Keenan Allen has been electric. They played the Patriots and the Eagles in the last 2 games, and he's had 18 catches for 180 yards and a touchdown in that span. So he's been very productive, must play. The guy I think you should consider sitting this week, and I might be wrong about this, and that's Mike Williams. And I know that sounds crazy, but this is a guy he's been in the league for many years, and he has disappointed for many years. So then suddenly he comes out with a monstrously hot 3 weeks to start the season. Everyone thinks he's legit, but here's what people don't realize. Since then, he is 44th in wide receiver scoring, and even that was carried by 1 performance. So when you look in his last 5 games, he had 1 game with 165 yards on 8 catches, and he found the end zone twice. That was monstrous, okay? What about the other 4 games in his last 5? He had 1 catch for 11 yards, 2 for 27, 2 for 58, and 2 for 19. He has been wildly underproductive. Now, this is a good matchup for him, but let's be honest, he just has not been good recently. Now, I'll say this. If you're a team who has a losing record or you're 500, you need to turn things around. You're in a tough matchup this week and you need lots of points. He is a guy who does have the chance to go out there and get you 45 fantasy points. So if you're looking for upside, he might still be playable. Of course, Jared Cook, you need to sit. The Vikings give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, and Cook is just 17th in tight end scoring. Also, I would sit the kicker Dustin Hopkins and sit the Chargers defense. Over their last 4 games, they're averaging just 6 fantasy points per game, and the Vikings have not been giving up a lot of points to opposing defenses. Up next, we got to talk about the Panthers at the Cardinals. Quick update. We'll start off with the Cardinals there, and Kyler Murray, that's the real question mark. Will he play? As of right now, it sounds like his ankle is improving, and Kyler Murray himself said that he's optimistic he'll be able to play this week. But we also know that the Cardinals said that they're keeping the long term in mind, and they don't want to rush him back. He has not practiced at all this week, so that's certainly a bad sign. But we also know that Cliff Kingsbury has no problem playing Kyler Murray whether or not he practices this week. Sounds like it's going to be a game time decision, but you know what? I'll be honest with you. I have a very solid feeling that he is going to be playing this week. I don't think he would say that he is optimistic if he weren't optimistic. And, you know, when they say things like we're going to keep the long term in mind, yes, they are, but that's also probably coach speak. So Kyler Murray, I'd be willing to bet he's going to play this week. And if he does, of course, you need to start him. As far as the running backs go, James Conner, got to play this guy. 10 touchdowns in his last 7 games. He has 4 multi-touchdown games. He's been very, very effective. Oh, yeah, and Chase Edmonds is currently marked as doubtful to play in this coming week. So, sole running back there, meaning he should see some extra touches, a little more time on the field. You need to start James Conner. He's been very effective out there. Not super efficient, but effective in fantasy. Know the difference. I'm not saying that he's been the most efficient running back, but when you're scoring 10 touchdowns in 7 games, you know, it's hard not to start that guy. And I don't think it's a fluke. It's a product of being in that offense. It's sort of the LeGarrette Blount thing. When he had like 3.8 yards per carry and still had 18 touchdowns on the year, it kind of reminds me of that situation. As far as the wide receivers go, DeAndre Hopkins, right now with that hamstring injury, he is currently set as day-to-day. Sounds like he will also play this week, but you know the phrase, day-to-day, you got to keep your eye on that. Can't exactly tell you how that's going to turn out, so just pay attention. He is DeAndre Hopkins, so start him if he plays. As far as the other wide receivers go, Christian Kirk really stepped up last game without Hopkins. He had 6 targets and caught all of them for 91 yards. He has a much higher value if Hopkins is out. Either way, I would play him, but if Hopkins is out, Kirk becomes a wide receiver 2. If Hopkins plays, Kirk becomes a wide receiver 3. I would sit both Green and Moore. Green is currently on the currently missed last game with COVID. Should be back this week. That being said, they're really just splitting the wide receiver 3 role there, as well as they have Zach Ertz, who we'll talk about in a second. But there's not really consistent, reliable fantasy value from Rondale Moore or AJ Green, so I tend to avoid that situation. I think you got to start Zach Ertz. Had a bit of an off game last game, but he didn't have Kyler Murray, and that's really the defining factor for me. They still played well, but Colt McCoy is just not Kyler Murray, and so I think that's really something to be, considered there. Sorry, I just got a text in the middle of reading my notes here. Anyways, Zach Ertz, you got to play him. 2 touchdowns in 3 games with Kyler Murray. He's been very effective, very safe red zone target. And again, it is at the tight end position where there's not a lot of talent. I would start Matt Prater if Kyler Murray is back, and I would start the Cardinals defense that is currently 2nd in fantasy points. Taking a look at the other side, the Carolina Panthers, here's what we know right now. Sam Darnold is on the IR. He's going to miss quite a few weeks with that fractured scapula or whatever that is. I don't know what it is. It doesn't really matter. Fact of the matter is they went out and signed Cam Newton. You're not going to start Cam Newton, but I can't wait to watch him play. I imagine he will get the start over P.J. Walker there as the backup, or Fleck, or whatever his name is. As far as some of the other guys there go, Christian McCaffrey, he's really played just fully healthy in 3 games. He's been effective in those games, but he's been very banged up this year. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey, if he's out on the field and he's healthy, you got to start him every single week, though there's, drastically drop what you expect from him with all these, kind of quarterback confusion and everything going on in this offense and the struggle they've had over the past few weeks. As far as the receivers go, what about DJ Moore? You got to play DJ Moore, even though you got to drop your expectations for him. Right now, he is top 10 in fantasy points amongst receivers, and he's done that only scoring in 2 games this year. In fact, he hasn't scored since week 4. So here's the funny thing. The way he's been producing has been based off of volume, which is exactly what you're probably going to see from whoever's playing quarterback this week, is them dependably relying on and continuing to throw to his number one option in DJ Moore. So even if he doesn't find the end zone, he could likely remain with the same sort of value that he has had all year long. But hey, maybe some things turn around and he does find the end zone. Either way, start him. He is, again, top 12, meaning he is a number 1 fantasy receiver this year, but I would expect him to be a more low-end wide receiver too. You need to sit all other Panthers receivers. Brandon Zylstra is out on the IR. Oh yeah, and Robbie Anderson and Terrace Marshall combined for 1 catch and 2 yards last game. That just says avoid that situation like crazy. I'm going to sit both tight ends, their kicker Zane Gonzalez, and I think you need to sit the Panthers defense as well. All right, next game up, Eagles at Broncos. Let's start off with the Eagles first and Jalen Hurts. Now, he's kind of cooled off lately. And he's going up against the Broncos, who give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Now, I'm not saying you should sit Jalen Hurts this week. I still think he's got a ton of fantasy value. He's a guy who could easily get you 90 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns, go 250 to 300 yards. Like, he's huge ceiling. But it's a really tough matchup against a Broncos team that really stuck it to Dallas just recently. So, if you've got a good option out there, I would consider it. I'm not saying necessarily to do it because, you might be in a large league and not have great weapons out there. But if you have another quarterback that you like and, you see them in a favorable matchup, I might consider doing that. And if you do play him, yeah, you can still play him, but lower your expectations closer to that QB 12 and not closer to the quarterback 1 sort of week. As far as the running back situation goes, I'm just going to say it's a mess, it's ugly, and it makes me uncomfortable. But there really seems to be one guy emerging there, and that's Jordan Howard. Here's the tough thing. The last 2 games, he has scored 3 touchdowns, and here's what really gets me. 2 games ago, he had 12 carries, and last game, he had 17. He looked very effective, 17 for 71, but it was against the Lions and then against the Chargers. His last 2 games, very easy against bad run defenses. Now the Broncos, 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. I'm going to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of things that says start him. But for me, I'm probably going to sit him unless I'm dealing with injuries, bye weeks, right? Unless I'm desperate. So I would actually consider Jordan Howard a high-end running back 3 in standard. He is extremely touchdown dependent, and that makes me nervous when there's so many other running backs there, like Boston Scott and Gainwell. And again, that's with Miles Sanders being out. When he comes back, that's going to offer up even more concerns and everything going on like that. So tend to avoid that situation, but seems like the RB1 there is Jordan Howard. As far as the wide receivers go, there's only one receiver to start there, and that's Devonta Smith. And he really surprised me. Going up against that dominant elite Chargers pass defense, he just went 100-plus yards and a touchdown in the best game that he has had all year versus the Chargers, who gave up the worst performance that they've allowed any receiver to do against them. Devonta Smith is really developing into his own. Start him this week. I think you should start Dallas Goedert, even though it's a tough matchup. The Broncos give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. They have just great linebacking group there. I would sit the kicker Jake Elliott and sit the Eagles defense. They have 5 games this year with 1 fantasy point or less. The Eagles defense has been just brutal in fantasy this season. Taking a look at the other side there, what about Denver? What about the Broncos? Starting off with Teddy Bridgewater. I think you need to sit him. In fact, this year, so far, he is more likely to finish outside of the top 22 than he is to finish inside of the top 12. Now he plays the Eagles, who actually do have a good pass defense, not elite, not going to win him a Super Bowl, but they are a good pass defense. For me, I'm going to avoid that. I'm going to sit Bridgewater. I'm going to start both Gordon and Javonte Williams at running back. I think you can play them as RB2s this week. Now, they're both a little borderline, right? Both of them make me a little nervous. But again, and I say this in every video, they're both top 24 running backs as far as a lot of their fantasy performances, especially recently. They've really found a groove in that offense. They've continued to give both of them a lot of touches, and you include bye weeks, injuries, disappointments, tough matchups, albeit I'm going to take these guys. So I do think Melvin Gordon has more value. He's been a little bit more effective, getting more touches and finding the end zone more, but the long-term guy there is Javonte Williams. Not that that necessarily matters in this video. As far as the wide receivers go, you can play Sutton and Judy as low-end wide receiver threes. I would sit Tim Patrick. Last game was fun to watch. He played well, but I think that's a bit of a fluke. He's very hard to predict, and he is the wide receiver 3 there. I like Judy. I like Sutton, but this is far too low volume of an offense for me to call them anything more than a low-end receiver 3. They are, however, fairly safe starts. I think you can start Noah Fant. I would sit their kicker, Brandon McManus, and start the Broncos defense this week. Our next game to talk about is Seahawks at Packers. It's going to be a fun game to watch because Russell Wilson has been cleared to play. He is back, and you need to start him. Now, you should lower your expectations a bit. The Packers have held 5 of their last 6 quarterbacks to 1 touchdown or less, but he's got some phenomenal receivers. So let's actually skip the running backs, go to the receivers. We'll come back to the running backs in a second. But part of the reason you need to start Russell Wilson is because his receivers, they've been great. Lockett just had 12 catches for 142 yards with Geno Smith. Metcalf has 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games with Geno Smith. Now they get a much better quarterback. Play both the receivers, play Russell Wilson. It's a great combination. Both those wideouts are top 26 in scoring this year. Even in a tough matchup, they're going to be fine. Now, as always, we want to identify that is a tough matchup. So lower your expectations. You're right. The odds of Russell Wilson throwing for 400 yards and 5 touchdowns, probably not going to happen this game, but he's still Russell Wilson. He's still got great weapons. If he's healthy, 300 yards and 2 or 3 touchdowns, very doable, right? I don't think that's crazy to expect that to happen from this offense, especially with the running game that they have going on there. And let's talk about that. Of course, we know that their lead back there is out right now, so we have Alex Collins filling in, and he looked good for a little bit, but he has just stunk the last couple of weeks, hasn't been super effective. I would say that you should still start him. He is a volume running back who's seeing the majority of the touches. He's going to be more of a standard league start, but he struggled the last couple of games, mostly and probably because Geno Smith is in that offense. How much better are they with Russell Wilson? I don't have huge, super high expectations for him, but as a low-end RB2 or a flex play, that's where I would put Alex Collins in this matchup. I would sit their tight ends Everett and Disley. I'm going to sit their kicker Jason Myers and the Seattle defense. Let's talk about the quarterbacks now. What about Aaron Rodgers? Now, sounds like the Packers are anticipating that he will play this week. So most likely he's going to play. If he does play, you should start him. But who knows? You need to monitor that with everything going on. Now he plays Seattle. Seattle has not allowed a quarterback more than 1 touchdown in 5 straight games. There have been a very mediocre fantasy numbers from Aaron Rodgers so far this year, 13th in fantasy scoring, but he has missed a game due to the COVID thing. He has had a bye week, and he had that fluke week 1 where he hadn't practiced all year, and they were a mess. You cut those out, he has been perfectly fine this year. I would start him, and I don't have necessarily massive expectations, but this could be a shootout. He could have a big day. As far as running backs go, Aaron Jones, got to play this guy. He's currently 8th in running back scoring. He is an RB1. He's been very productive. Start Aaron Jones. Of course, keep an eye on A.J. Dillon there, his backup. He's been eating out a larger role. I'm not comfortable starting him yet as all of the touchdowns are being funneled to Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones is the pass-catching guy. He is effective in the running game. He's the running back. So for me, play Jones, have confidence in him. Probably not so much confidence in Dynasty. We'll see what happens next year, however. As far as the wide receivers go, start Devontae Adams and sit all other wideouts. You already know that. I don't even need to break it down for you. Sit all tight ends there. Robert Tonyan's out on the IR. I'd sit Crosby, and I would start the Packers defense if by chance Russell Wilson is out, but I really don't think that's going to happen. I am 95% sure Wilson will play this week. In that case, I'm going to sit the Packers defense. All right, now we got to get into the Chiefs at the Raiders. I want to talk about the Raiders first. I think you should play Derek Carr this week. Going against the Chiefs, it's a perfect matchup for a quarterback that has produced really well this year. And I think he's proven to people that he really can be a division-winning quarterback. He can take you as far as your team is capable of going. Now, Chiefs giving up the third most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but what really stands out about that is in a lot of games, they've had a pretty easy schedule. I think Carr's going to have a great game. He always seems to make the most out of whatever weapons he has available to him. I'd play Carr this week in probably that 5 to 8 range. I'm not expecting a low-end performance from him, but I'm not expecting a high-end performance either. As far as the running backs go, both Jacobs and Drake are 27th and 28th in running back scoring. Now, there's more touches for Jacobs. He's a better runner, but there's no catching performances there. And he has had less time as he'd missed time due to injury, and that seems to be when Drake has really taken over a little bit more. But over the last few games, they've both had touches while they were both out on the field. I would play Jacobs as more of a standard guy, and Drake as more of a flex play, more of a PPR guy, more of a fill-in for those reasons. But I think they're both very playable. As far as the wide receivers go, there's really no arguing it. Start Hunter Renfrow, sit all other wideouts, right? When we saw what happened with Henry Ruggs, okay, he's off the team. Boom, maybe Bryan Edwards steps up, right? He's a guy who was drafted and they developed him and he's shown some talent. Yeah, he had 0 catches last game. Just nope, avoid that. Play Hunter Renfrow and no one else. Oh, yeah, and then getting onto the tight end, you got to play Darren Waller. He really stepped up last game. 7 catches for 92 yards. That's a perfect example of what Waller does. Even though he didn't score a touchdown, he's been very productive. Now, he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 4, so that's a bit of a concern. But the Chiefs linebackers are bad. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. This could be a monster performance from Waller. I wouldn't be, and this sounds crazy, and maybe it's just me, I have a feeling he's going to go for like 200 receiving yards and a couple touchdowns this week. Could be wrong, but I think he's queued up and ready for one of those games. I'd start their kicker, Daniel Carlson, and sit the Raiders' defense. Taking a look here at the other side, this Chiefs team has been a bit of a mess lately. Pat Mahomes hasn't played well. Here's the thing, though. Let me just break it down for you nice and simple. Pat Mahomes is still 5th in fantasy quarterback scoring, and the Raiders' defense is not great. I would still play Pat Mahomes this week. Again, makes people nervous. Oh, what a bust. He's fine. He's got weapons. Speaking of his weapons, Kelsey's the number 1 tight end in fantasy scoring. You're going to start him. Tyreek Hill's the number 2 wide receiver in fantasy scoring. You're going to start him. Okay, now I would sit the kicker Harrison Butker and sit the Chiefs defense, leaving us now to the final thing we need to address for that Chiefs team, and that's Darrell Williams, the running back. A couple weeks ago, it looked like Derek Gore got some touches. He might, kind of work into that role. No, he fell off the earth last game, only saw 3 touches, didn't look very good. Williams, however, saw 23 touches, and he was the sole running back, and he looked fairly productive. I would play him as a high-end running back, too, in this game. This could be a definite shootout for sure. Again, I know there's some concerns surrounding this Chiefs team, but I think they're going to be just fine. Teams have struggles. They do. The Chiefs have been needing to fix issues that they've had for a long time, and they're finally having to do that. And that means you lose a few games, but it's probably good for them in the long run. And again, they've always had these issues. Teams are just not letting Pat Mahomes pull crap out of his butt and win games for no reason anymore. So, again, it's not like these problems are anything new. And I get what people are saying. Oh, my goodness, Pat Mahomes, he's throwing interceptions now. He's making mistakes. He doesn't look like that. So, wow, before they had issues with their defense and their offensive line, but now they have issues with their quarterback as well. They don't. It's called the savior syndrome. It's what happened to Carson Wentz there in Philadelphia. When you ask me to throw 42 times a game and you need me to throw 300 yards and 3 touchdowns so we can win, and if I don't do that, we lose, and you make me do that 3 or 4 seasons in a row, yeah, it gets to you. It wears you down. You play bad. You throw picks. You make mistakes. It happens. That's how you develop guys like Brett Favre, who, after long enough, I don't think Brett Favre knew how to not be a gunslinger. So, yeah, a guy like Pat Mahomes got his struggles, but I don't think it's his fault. I'm blaming that on the Chiefs. I think they're going to fix some things and be fine. All right, here, final game, Rams at 49ers. Let's break down the Rams first. Matthew Stafford, I think you need to start him. Plain and simple, 4th in quarterback scoring. Now he steps into an awesome matchup versus the 49ers. 49ers are giving up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. They just made Colt McCoy. Again, the Cardinals with Colt McCoy under center, put up 31 points and crush the 49ers. Yeah, I think the Rams are going to be just fine in this matchup, and I think Matthew Stafford's going to have a great day with all of the weapons that he's got. Speaking of those weapons, what about the wide receivers? We know that Cooper Kupp is the number one receiver in fantasy this year. He has been insane. He's so much fun to watch. He is just cannot put words to how dominant he is out on the field. But did you know that Robert Woods is 12th in wide receiver scoring, making him also a wide receiver one? He's been dominant too. And he's just been overshadowed because, the best receiver in the league is lined up across from him. So, oh my goodness, how do you cover that? Now they add Odell Beckham, who likely, and I don't think he'll be playing in this game, but next week, that's going to be a mess, right? That's going to be scary, difficult, and confusing. So play both those wide receivers and play the running back, Darrell Henderson. He's also top 12 in running back scoring, and the 49ers give up the 9th most fantasy points to running backs. It's a little standard league dependent there, but he's a volume running back, doesn't have to share the ball with anyone in a good offense that's going to find the red zone and find touchdowns. Yeah, play Henderson. As far as the tight end there Higbee goes, I'm going to sit him. Everyone else is producing in that offense, and the one thing they do well is cover tight ends. I'm going to start Matt Gay and start the Rams defense this week as well. Now we get to take a look at the 49ers. Pretty simple situation as a whole there. Maybe not quite as much fantasy value, but there's definitely some guys here you need to be playing. One of them, though, is not Jimmy Garoppolo. You need to sit him. The Rams give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. That being said, Jimmy Garoppolo does have 300-yard passing games in back-to-back games. But in one of those games, he didn't throw any touchdowns, so he's a little confusing. I wouldn't play him, especially in this matchup. As far as the running backs go, looks like Eli Mitchell has the rib injury. He remained sidelined at Thursday's practice. He is still questionable as to whether or not he'll play. I have a feeling he'll play. When he does, he is the sole back in that offense. Before getting hurt, he had back-to-back 100-yard games with touchdowns. He's a volume. If he's healthy, play Eli Mitchell. It's that clear. That being said, if it's not Mitchell, I wouldn't play whoever replaces him. I don't feel like you can trust those guys. As far as the wide receivers, though, Deebo Samuel, 4th in fantasy scoring, start him, duh. Brandon Ayuk drastically turned it around the last couple of games. I don't trust him yet, but he's playing better. I need a little more time, and I'd love to see what he does in this matchup. You can play him as a high-end wide receiver 4 with the potential of having a wide receiver 2 type game, but I think you might have some better options out there. You look at the waiver wire, or hopefully you've been paying attention, you've been stacking your roster. I think there are definitely some ones there. Finally, taking a look at it, George Kittle, got to play this guy, really turned it on last game, 6 catches for over 100 yards and a touchdown, back to George Kittle form. I think they're going to desperately need him in this game as they try to keep up with the, as they try to keep up with the Rams. I'm going to sit their kicker, Robbie Gould, and sit the 49ers defense as well.